Hey everybody, it's time for this week's market snapshot and what's happened in the Northern Virginia real estate market in the last 7 days in under 5 minutes and what this means to sellers. Here we go. All right, sellers, so the good news is spring has sprung. It did slow down just a little bit when that snowstorm came in and we had the ice, and it was a little treacherous getting out there and actually walking into and looking at and seeing properties. But we're seeing that activity pick up. We're seeing a lot of open house activity. We're seeing a lot of showing activity. We're seeing properties that are appropriately priced for their condition are moving very, very quickly with multiple offers. It is a great time for you. If you're waiting until the spring, you can go ahead and jump on the market now because spring has sprung, and you might have a little bit more of an advantage because if you get into the market now, you'll beat the other sellers that are coming in March and April, or maybe on the summer. So you have a little bit less competition, but still have that high buyer demand. You're going to see as we go through this that as long as you're priced appropriately and you move quickly, you will get at your listing price or above. You do need to be prepared to pay buyer agent commissions. 98% of the contracts that we're going to go through did have buyer agent compensation included in them. That's a new negotiable part since the lawsuit or since the settlement. And a lot of sellers were under the impression that they're no longer covering those. But 98% of sellers in this week's sampling did, 97% last week. So if you want to be competitive and be in those top properties, then it's more likely than not that you will end up paying some sort of buyer agent commissions. What that's going to be depends on the contract because it's a part of a negotiable term on the contract. So it depends on the contract and the offer. So as a seller, make sure you're focusing on the net. I'm sure your agent's walking you through that and how to do that. Okay, let's get into the numbers. To remind you, what we're looking at here is we're looking at supply versus demand, and we're looking at the last 7 days of activity. So we're seeing the actual real-time buyer activity for the last 7 days and the real-time seller activity for the last 7 days. Buyer activity, of course, indicates demand. Seller activity, of course, indicates supply. So supply versus demand, that tells us how competitive we have to be if you're a buyer with your offers. If a seller is looking at that tells you what you should be able to expect with offers coming in and how you should position your property in the market with the competition. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Please excuse my phone ringing there. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into this. So as always, the black line is our buyer activity line. These are the properties that went under contract in the last 7 days. And you can see that the buyer activity, we did slow down for that snowstorm back here. And then last week we started picking up, and then this week we picked up again. So buyer activity is increasing and on a steady uptrend. You can see a steady uptick here. Without this snowstorm, we probably would have seen this be a more steady upward momentum. Inventory, you can see inventory is increasing dramatically as well. And you can see it was kind of flat this last week, but it's still on an upward trend. So both buyer activity and inventory are on upward trends. And you can see that buyer activity for this week is actually higher than the buyer activity was last year at this time. Inventory is just about the same. So buyer activity, that demand is there. I think this is being powered by the interest rates, which actually went down a little bit again today. This gap you can see increased, and so this gives us a larger gap from demand versus supply. So if we go down to our buyer's market versus seller's market, you can see we have our gray line here, which is our normal neutral market. Anything above this line is considered a seller's market. Anything below is considered a buyer's market. And you can see that we ticked up a little bit more in the seller's market. So we are on a steady upward trend of going into that spring seller's market. So now let's dive into what the contracts are doing, what we've actually seen. So these are what was received by Cardinal Title from February 3rd to February 9th. You can see that this is a data collection of 155 contracts. We're going to focus on the Virginia area here. You can see that 68% of the properties went at or above list price. And you can see down here that 70% of properties went at or before 21 days on the market. So 29% were at 21 days, 8 to 21 days. And then 41% sold in 7 days. So almost half of the properties that went on the market went under contract in that first week. What's interesting is only 35% went above asking price. So properties are moving quickly, but buyers have choices. So in some situations, they may have been the only offer on the table, so they got to get the property at the asking price. So again, 68% are going at or above asking price, and 70% are going at 21 days or less on the market. So that buyer activity is picking up pretty dramatically. The key here, 33%, is all that went under listing price, and that matches to 30% that stayed 22 days plus on the market. So as a seller, it's really important that first 7 days is critical, but then that first 21 days is also very important to make sure you at least get that asking price or above. Financing versus cash, 12% were cash offers. And then over here in the contingencies, so buyers are still getting their contingencies. They're getting a little bit less. So we've been averaging 75 to 80% yes on finance contingencies. We're down to 70-30 here. But then appraisal contingencies have stayed pretty consistent, about 3/4 getting them and 1/4 not. Home inspection contingency. So let's see, 66%, this makes no sense. 66% and 14%, that only adds up to 80%. So I'm not really sure what happened there. We're gonna have to not count that transaction here, but it looks like if the graph is somewhat accurate, the majority of people are getting home inspections. I would be surprised by that, so let's just kind of not pay attention to this statistic for this week. Contract to close period of time, 31 to 60 day were 40%, 16 to 30 days were 49%. So the majority of properties, once they went under contract, are closing quicker than 30 days. So we're gonna see that trend increasing as we go into the spring market. So that's why it's so important as a buyer that you have your pre-approval done and get as far through that process as you can, that you have your inspector ready to go, because you want to be able to shorten that contract time to be able to compete. That's one of the terms that you can use to actually make a competitive offer. And then from the buyer agent compensation, you can see 98% of these contracts did have buyer agent compensation covered by the seller. So it's important for buyers to know that that it's likely you're going to get at least a portion of your buyer agent compensation covered by the seller through the contract. And it's important for sellers to know that in this competitive market, most sellers are covering some buyer agent compensation. In fact, 81% is at 2.5% or higher. So just prepare yourself mentally that you likely will need to cover some of that buyer agent compensation. It is a term in the contract, it is negotiable, but just be prepared that you're likely to see that on the contract. Okay, if you guys have any questions, either on the buy side or the sell side, Kelly and I are happy to sit down with you and do a strategy session with you, and at no charge. And even if you end up not using us for your transaction, you'll get a lot of information that you can take with you moving forward. Give us a call at 703-783-2143. Wish you guys all the best out there, and be safe and have a good weekend.